The ontologically relevant result of the foregoing analysis of being with is the insight that the subject character of one's own Dasein and of the others is to be defined existentially, that is, in terms of certain ways to be. In what is taken care of in the surrounding world, others are encountered as what they are what they do. In taking care of the things which one has taken hold of, for and against others, there is constant care as to the way one differs from them, whether this difference is to be equalized, whether one's own Dasein has lagged behind others and wants to catch up in relation to them, whether Dasein in its priority over others is intent on suppressing them. Being with one another is, unknown to itself, disquieted by the care about this distance. Existentially expressed, being with one another has the character of distentiality. The more inconspicuous this kind of being is to everyday Dasein itself, all the more stubbornly and primordially does it work itself out. But this distentiality which belongs to being with is such that, as everyday being with one another, Dasein stands in subservience to other. It itself is not, though others have taken its being away from it. The everyday possibilities of being of Dasein are at the disposal of the whims of others. These others are not definite others. On the contrary, any other can represent them. What is decisive is only the inconspicuous domination by others that Dasein as being with has already taken over unaware. One belongs to the others oneself and entrenches their power. The others, whom one designates as such in order to cover over one's own essential belonging to them, are those who are there initially and for the most part in everyday being with one another. The who is not this one and not that one, not oneself, not some, and not the sum of them all. The who is the neuter, the they. We have shown earlier how the public surrounding world is always already at hand and taken care of in the surrounding world nearest to us. In utilizing public transportation, in the use of information services such as the newspaper, every other is like the next. This being with one another dissolves one's own Dasein completely into the kind of being of the others, in such a way that the others, as distinguishable and explicit, disappear more and more. In this inconspicuousness and unascertainability, the they unfolds its true dictatorship. We enjoy ourselves and have fun the way they enjoy themselves. We read, see, and judge literature and art the way they see and judge. We also withdraw from the great mass, the way they withdraw. We find shocking what they find shocking. They, which is nothing definite and which all are, though not as a sum, prescribes the kind of being of everydayness. The they has its own ways to be. The tendency of being with which we call distentiality is based on the fact that being with one another as such creates averageness. It is an existential characteristic of the they. In its being, the they is essentially concerned with average. Thus, the they maintains itself factically in the averageness of what belongs to it, what it does and does not consider valid, and what it grants or denies success. This averageness, which prescribes what can and may be ventured, watches over every exception which thrusts itself to the fore. Every priority is noiselessly squashed. Overnight, everything that is original is flattened down as something long since known. Everything won through struggle becomes something manageable. Every mystery loses its power. The care of averageness reveals, in turn, an essential tendency of Dasein, which we call the leveling down of all possibilities of being. Distentiality, averageness, and leveling down, as ways of being of the they, constitute what we know as publicness. Publicness initially controls every way in which the world and Dasein are interpreted, and it is always right, not because of an eminent and primary relation of being to things, not because it has an explicitly appropriate transparency of Dasein at its disposal, but because it does not get to the heart of the matter, because it is insensitive to every difference of level and genuineness. Publicness obscures everything, and then claims that what has been thus covered over is what is familiar and accessible to everybody. They is everywhere, but in such a way that it is always already stolen away when Dasein presses for a decision. However, because the they presents every judgment and decision as its own, it takes the responsibility of Dasein away from it. They can, as it were, manage to have them constantly invoking. It can most easily be responsible for everything, because no one has to vouch for anything. They always did it, and yet it can be said that no one did it. In the everydayness of Dasein, most things happen in such a way that we must say, no one did it. In this way, the they disburdens Dasein in its everydayness. Not only that, but disburdening it of its being, the they accommodates Dasein in its tendency to take things easily and make them easy. And since the they constantly accommodates Dasein by disburdening its being sainsent lasto, it retains and entrenches its stubborn dominance. Everyone is the other, and no one is himself. The they, which supplies the answer to the who of everyday Dasein, is the nobody to whom every Dasein has always surrendered itself, in its being among one another. In these characteristics of being which we have laid out everyday being among one another, distentiality, averageness, leveling down, publicness, disburdening of one's being, and accommodation lies the initial constancy of Dasein. This constancy pertains not to the enduring objective presence of something, but to the kind of being of Dasein as being with. Existing in the modes we have mentioned, the self of one's own Dasein and the self of the other have neither found nor lost themselves. One is in the manner of dependency and in authenticity. This way of being does not signify a lessening of the facticity of Dasein, just as the they as the nobody is not nothing. On the contrary, in this kind of being Dasein is an ens realissimum, if by reality we understand being sane that has the character of Dasein. Of course, the they is as little objectively present as Dasein itself. The more openly the they behaves, the more slippery and hidden it is, but then too the less is it nothing at all. The unprejudiced ontocontological I, it reveals itself as the most real subject of everydayness. And if it is not accessible like an objectively present stone, that is not the least decisive with regard to its kind of being. One may neither decree prematurely that this they is really nothing, nor profess the opinion that the phenomenon has been interpreted ontologically if one explains it as the result of the objective presence of several subjects which one has put together in hindsight. On the contrary, the elaboration of the concepts of being must be guided by these indubitable phenomena. Nor is the they something like a universal subject, which hovers over a plurality of subjects. One could understand it this way only if the being of subjects is understood as something unlike Dasein, and if these are regarded as factually objectively present cases of an existing genus. With this approach, the only possibility ontologically is to understand everything which is not a case of this sort in the sense of genus and species. They is not the genus of an individual Dasein, nor can it be found in this being as an abiding quality. That traditional logic also fails in the face of these phenomena cannot surprise us if we consider that it has its foundation in an ontology of objective presence and ontology which is still crude. Thus, it fundamentally cannot be made more flexible no matter how many improvements and expansions might be made. These reforms of logic, oriented toward the humanistic sciences, only increase the ontological confusion. They is an existential, and belongs as a primordial phenomenon to the positive constitution of Dasein. It has, in turn, various possibilities of concretion as a characteristic of Dasein. The extent to which its dominance becomes penetrating and explicit may change historically. The self of everyday Dasein is the they self, which we distinguish from the authentic self, that is, the self which has explicitly grasped itself. As the they self, Dasein is dispersed in the they and must first find itself. This dispersion characterizes the subject of the kind of being which we know as heedful absorption in the world encountered as closest. If Dasein is familiar with itself as the they self, this also means that the they prescribes the nearest interpretation of the world and of being in the world. The they itself, for the sake of which Dasein is every day, articulates the referential context of significance. The world of Dasein frees the beings encountered for a totality of relevance, which is familiar to the they in the limits, which are established with the averageness of the they. Initially, factical Dasein is in the with world, discovered in an average way. Initially, I am not in the sense of my own self, but I am the others in the mode of the they. In terms of the they, and as the they, I am initially given to myself. Initially, Dasein is the they, and for the most part it remains so. If Dasein explicitly discovers the world and brings it near, if it discloses its authentic being to itself, this discovering of world and disclosing of Dasein always comes about by clearing away coverings and obscurities, by breaking up the disguises with which Dasein cuts itself off from itself. With this interpretation of being with and being oneself in the they, the question of the who in the everydayness of being with one another is answered. These considerations have at the same time given us a concrete understanding of the basic constitution of Dasein. Being in the world became visible in its everydayness and averageness. Everyday Dasein derives the pre-ontological interpretation of its being from the closest kind of being of the they. The ontological interpretation initially follows this tendency of interpretation. It understands Dasein in terms of the world and finds it there as an inner-worldly being. But that is not all. The closest, ontology of Dasein takes the meaning of being on the basis of which these existing subjects are understood also in terms of the world. But since the phenomenon of world itself is passed over in this absorption in the world, it is replaced by objective presence in the world, by thing. The being of beings, which is there too, comes to be understood as objective presence. Thus, by showing the positive phenomenon of closest everyday being in the world, we have made possible an insight into the basic reason why the ontological interpretation of this constitution of being is lacking. It itself, in its everyday kind of being, is what initially misses itself and covers itself over. If the being of everyday being with one another, which seems ontologically to approach mere objective presence, is really fundamentally different from that kind of presence, then the being of the authentic self can be understood still less as objective presence. Authentic being a self is not based on an exceptional state of the subject, detached from the they, but is an existential modification of the they as an essential existential. But then, the sameness of the authentically existing self is separated ontologically by a gap from the identity of the I maintaining itself in the multiplicity of its experiences.